I'm originally from Miami Beach, Florida, so the first thing I ask when I speak is, can you hear me in the back of the room? I don't know if you can. I cannot see any of you. I sort of feel like a French fry under this light. But can you hear me in the back of the room? Yeah. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the rabbi for that truly inspiring introduction. And I want to thank Andrew and the Jewish Federation for hosting this event, and especially Andrew for those words at the beginning to make sure that I'm properly protected. You should know that I come from Israel. Our Knesset is a little bit different than your Congress. Remember, a few years ago, you may recall, a member of Congress shouted out at one of your State of the Union addresses, "You lie," to President Obama, which was a terrible breach of protocol in your system. Well, the next morning, I was in Israel working on a speech for my prime minister that he was going to give at the Knesset, and I turned on the news at about 7:30 in the morning, and they were still talking about it on CNN, about how appalling this was and such a breach of etiquette. And I said to the person in my office, I said, you know, if we could get the Prime Minister of Israel into and out of the Knesset with only one person calling him a liar, they'd give us the Israel Prize. So I thank you for that. But I know we're going to have a good conversation, and I'm happy to listen to all of your questions and hopefully to answer the easy ones. But I appreciate that very much. I have wanted to come to this city and this community for many, many years. Firstly, because I'm a baseball fan. And if you're a basketball fan, you go to Indiana. And if you're a baseball fan, you come here to St. Louis. And you have Hornsby and Musial and Gibson and Brock and the Wizard of Oz, and this may be dating me, but Orta was out. Orta was out. You had a World Series stolen from you 30 years ago. And now an official representative of another sovereign state is telling you it should make you feel more Jewish, that long suffering for no reason, thinking something was taken away from you unjustly. But the truth of the matter is St. Louis has a reputation of being one of the great Jewish communities in the United States. I have over the years met a number of people who have come out of this community, and they have become friends. And you know that there's something special here. I saw it a few months ago after the desecration of your cemetery. When you saw the spirit of this town and how you rallied together, that was very powerful for everyone to see. To see the vice president here, the governor here, members throughout the community speaking out against this hatred and darkness. And there are obviously dark forces that are still around in the United States. You saw them in Charlottesville over the weekend. I'm glad to hear strong statements from the left to the right, from the top to the bottom. Everyone has a duty to speak out. That duty particularly falls on the shoulders of leaders. And I was pleased to hear a very strong statement today. And I hope that all Americans will join together in shining a light on this darkness and forcing it back, quite frankly, from under the rock which it came. And I want to thank Governor Greitens for being here today. You're going to get sick of me by the end of my visit here. I think we're going to be together a lot. I learned that we actually went to the same college at Oxford University, which is rare. It's Lady Margaret Hall. And you probably, Governor, made the same mistake I did. You see, I thought that it was still an all-girls college when I applied. And apparently you went there a couple years after me. But I just want to tell you how much I thank you for your courage and for your service to this country. We are a fellow democracy, and the people who wear the uniform for this great country, the United States, you are protecting our freedom as well. And I want to thank you for your courage and your sacrifice and your service to the country. Now, most times when I speak as ambassador, I speak about the formidable challenges, I should say, that are facing Israel. And we're going to have a time for you to ask a lot of tough questions about those challenges, and I'm looking forward to it. But I want to talk about something beyond those challenges, and they are great. We have serious security challenges around Israel, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Gaza, from Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. We have the challenge of Iran and a nuclear deal that didn't put that problem of a potentially nuclear-armed Iran behind us. It actually puts it in front of us. And the problem of Iran's rising power in the region. We have the problem of trying to forge a secure peace with all our neighbors, particularly and especially the Palestinians. And that's a very serious challenge for Israel. We also face a challenge of effectively integrating different parts of Israel's population, from Israeli Arabs to ultra-Orthodox Jews to Ethiopian immigrants. That's a serious challenge facing Israel. And we also face a challenge of ensuring that Israel always remains a place where all Jews around the world can feel at home. That defines who we are as a state. That's the raison d'etre of Israel. And that remains a serious challenge. And we also have a challenge of a rising tide of anti-Semitism around the world. Earlier today I was in Arkansas, and I was there for a signing ceremony with one of your fellow governors on legislation that the Arkansas House and Senate had passed against the BDS movement, which is an anti-Semitic movement. And that's why it was important for me to go there. And so we have that challenge as well. And I'm sure that you will ask me many questions about that, and we'll have more time to discuss them. But in the time that I have, I don't want to focus on Israel's enormous challenges. I want to pick up on what you said, Andrew, and what the rabbis said earlier. And I want to tell you why I am so optimistic about Israel's future, and why everyone here should be deeply, deeply grateful for the miracle called Israel. Now, that's going to be hard, because you see, we Jews like to see the glass as 1/16 empty. We have a unique capacity for seeing the glass as 1/16 empty. But the truth of the matter is that the glass is overflowing. There are so many reasons for optimism. There is so much to be proud of. You know, last year there was a ranking of the most powerful countries in the world from a leading publication in the United States. Israel ranked 8th. 8th. And it wasn't the local Hadassah chapter of Nashville that put out that publication. By the way, I love Nashville. That's why I can say that. I think it was U.S. News and World Report. We were 8th. There were the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France. Then there was Japan, Germany, and Israel. Think about that. Think about that. All of you who can remember a different Israel, 20 years ago, certainly 50 years ago, 69 years ago, the 8th most powerful country in the world. We are the size of New Jersey. We have 8.5 million people, and we are ranked the 8th most powerful country in the world. Why? Well, first, we've got a very strong military, a very strong military that's getting stronger. We have the most advanced offensive capabilities, thanks in large measure to the remarkable alliance that we have with the United States. A few months ago, Israel received its first 5th-generation aircrafts, the Joint Strike Fighter, which was delivered to Israel, 2 of them, and it's going to become part of our fleet. We're the first country out of the United States to have that capability. And we also have, I should say, remarkable defensive capabilities that we developed also with the support of the United States. We have the Iron Dome system, which many of you are familiar with, that has intercepted thousands of rockets that have been fired at us from Gaza. We also have a David's sling system that is now operational, which helps us and will help us, hopefully we'll never need it, to withstand the threat that comes from Hezbollah in Lebanon. We also have an Arrow missile defense system, which can help us withstand the missile threat from Iran. So we have tremendous offensive and defensive capabilities, and we have been very blessed to sign a new memorandum of understanding last year with the previous administration, and we're deeply grateful that that MOU was signed, despite disagreements that we had about the best course in confronting Iran, the best course to advance peace. With the previous administration, we signed an agreement, an MOU, that ensures military assistance for Israel for 10 years. So we're going to be even stronger militarily in the future. Israel also has a remarkably strong economy. Many people don't know this. In 1948, Israel had the same GDP per capita as Egypt and Jordan. Today, Israel has a higher GDP per capita than Japan and the EU average. It's around 40,000 per capita. See, the problem with Israel when it comes to GDP per capita is not the GDP. It's see, we don't have enough capita. We don't have enough people. So while we have a very robust and strong economy, we're a small nation with a huge defense burden that we have to put on our shoulders. One of the issues that has come up in your politics recently, it's really global politics, about the importance of countries around the world paying their fair share. And there's actually a lot of truth in that argument. The United States spends about 3.5% of its GDP on defense. A lot of European countries barely spend 1%, some 2% at the top, Britain and France. Israel spends 6% without U.S. assistance, 6%. With U.S. assistance, it's about 8%. So we have this enormous burden, and we're very grateful and thankful that the United States helps us share that burden. We also think that we give a lot of bang for your buck. You have spent about $2 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq. You've paid a huge price, not just in treasure, but in blood, of your soldiers, of those killed and those wounded. That money is about 5 centuries of support for Israel. And we have never asked Israel for Americans to risk their lives to defend us. We defend ourselves. But in addition to having this need, this military need, we have a very robust and strong economy in Israel, and an economy that is getting stronger and stronger and stronger as we move into a 21st century of knowledge, where the ability to create conceptual products becomes key to growth. Now, Israel, ladies and gentlemen, is a global technological power. It's hard for Jews to appreciate that. They think it's a story we just tell other people. But Israel is a global technological power, a global power. Again, not the newsletter from the local chapter of Hadassah. The Israeli ambassador, if there would be one 30 years ago at this podium, if they would have stood here and said to you that in 30 years, Israel is going to be a leader in high tech in the world, you would have, on your way out that door, you would have always said to yourself, nice Jewish boy, but that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But it's happened. Last year in 2016, tiny Israel, which accounts for 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, accounted for 20% of global investment in cybersecurity. 20%. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that Israel is punching 200 times above its weight. So we're not a country of 8.5 million people in relative terms. We're bigger than a China. The equivalent of about 1.5 billion people in cyber. In agriculture, Israel is a global technological power. In water, Israel's a global technological power. Our national economic advisor said a couple of years ago, I was with him in a meeting with his American counterpart, and he said, I can take a 1,600 time longer shower than you can. And that wasn't a comment on his hygiene habits. He said to him, Israel recycles almost 90% of its water. It's about 88%. The United States is about 1%. And then what we do with that recycled water is we put it through an Israeli innovation that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of called drip irrigation. You sort of spray it on your fields. Every time I see one of those commercials where you're spraying it and it's supposed to look very lush and the rolling plains of the United States, most Israelis who see that, what a waste of water, because drip irrigation is 20 times more efficient. We're number 2, by the way, in the world in recycling is Spain, and they're about 20%. So Israel is orders of magnitude better in water conservation and technology than any other country, and that's affecting our relationships around the world. And recently, those of you who follow news in Israel closely may know that we have a car industry in Israel. We don't build cars in Israel, and we're not going to build cars. But when it comes to autonomous vehicles, Israel is way ahead of the pack. Intel spent $15 billion, $15 billion, not even shekels, dollars. $15 billion to buy an Israeli company, Mobileye. But it's not just that they bought the company, it's that they handed the keys to the whole autonomous vehicle space and industry around the world that Intel is involved in to this company because they have such faith in their ability to develop these products. All of that is happening in Israel. 42 out of 50 of the leading tech companies in the world have R&D facilities in Israel. And for some of them, it's the only facility that they have outside the United States. That's why the BDS movement that I spoke about before, it's not an economic threat to Israel. It's not. Because Apple, Intel, Cisco, and Microsoft are not investing in Israel because they're Zionists. If they were, it would be an economic threat. They invest in Israel because they want to make money for their shareholders. And to think that these companies are going to boycott Israel is to think that they're going to boycott Silicon Valley. It's not going to happen. BDS is not an economic threat, it's a moral threat. Because people want to turn Israel into a pariah state, want to demonize the country, and we should fight back against it. But it's not an economic threat to it. We are a global technological power. Strong in security, strong in economy. And here's something that may surprise many of you. Israel is becoming a very strong diplomatic power. Now, that's not something you're going to read about in the news every day, because the narrative that you probably are exposed to is that Israel is more isolated than ever. Israel is actually less isolated than it's ever been in its history. I'll say that again. Israel is less isolated than it's ever been in its history. You know, we were just visited last month by the leader of a small country in Asia with 1.2 billion people called India. Prime Minister Modi last month became the first Indian prime minister in nearly 70 years to visit Israel. Israel's relations with another small Asian country called China have catapulted forward. Same thing with Japan, with South Korea, with almost all of Eastern Europe, with Russia, with Africa. The prime minister's made 2 trips to Africa. First time in decades it was an Israeli prime minister in Africa. And now he's going to be making a trip to Latin America as well. Why are our relationships with all these countries being transformed? It's because of the first 2 things that I said, security and economy, specifically technology. These countries want Israel's help in addressing the security problems that they face, which are formidable. And these countries want Israel's help in bettering the lives of their people through our technology. They look around the world and they think, who can help our countries? And they see Israel as an answer for many of them. And that's why they're coming. And I very much believe in the years ahead we might actually succeed, I should say, in cracking the automatic majorities against Israel at the United Nations. Because what we are saying to these countries is just vote your interests. All of you who are stuck in the voting patterns from decades ago are like that Japanese soldier who was on the Lubang Island in the Philippines fighting a war that had ended decades earlier, just no one sent him the memo. Many of these countries are stuck in these old patterns, and I think that's going to change. It's not going to happen in a day, but it can actually happen in a few years. And so, strong in economy, strong militarily, and strong diplomatically. By the way, one area where you see this change happening is within the Arab world. This is a story that a lot of people do not know. Because of the rise of Iran and the empowerment of Iran, many Arab countries are looking at Israel in a different light. We're no longer seen as an enemy. We're seen as a potential ally in dealing with the challenges that they have. Now, we have a serious problem at translating that into a sustainable peace process, because a lot of those governments have poisoned their populations for 70 years, so they can't simply just turn it on a dime. But I can tell you that Arab leaders, many of them are in a different place than they were even 3 years ago, certainly from where they were 10 years ago. But some of you may say, well, that's very good, Mr. Ambassador. You're talking about power, economic power, military power, diplomatic power. What about values? We are a Jewish state. It's our values that we took with us over the centuries. We didn't have power, but we sustain our values. Well, what about values? Well, I can tell you there, above all, is where you should be proud. You should be proud of Israel's democracy, of the resilience of our democracies, and I want to tell you why. It's not because Israel's a perfect country. We're not. No country is perfect. But democracies are tested under fire. They're tested during times of war, during times when there are serious security challenges. And Israel has passed that test with flying colors. Think about this country and what the situation was on September 12, 2001. Think about the feeling that everyone had that another attack could be imminent. And it's natural for a democracy to start making trade-offs between its security and civil liberties. It's natural. It happens everywhere, all the time, because people first and foremost want security. And then as that sense of danger recedes, people justifiably want the pendulum to swing back, to protect their cherished civil liberties. But understand, ladies and gentlemen, that Israel has been in September 12th for 69 years. The danger has not receded. And we have upheld our values under the most extreme conditions. I marvel at Israel's democracy because I was born and raised in the United States of America. Because I see this not as a perfect nation, but as a great nation and a great moral nation. And the morality is not defined by the actions of a few extremists. It's defined by how the public responds, by how leaders respond. That's what defines it. And those people who do not think that this is a great moral nation simply don't know history. They haven't studied how other superpowers and great powers have acted throughout history. And I always ask myself the question, since the day I moved to Israel 25 years ago, about 20 years ago I should say, I asked myself what I call the WWAD question. What would America do? What would America do if it was faced with the challenges that we're faced with? If thousands of missiles were flying into American cities, if 2/3 of Americans were huddling in bomb shelters, what would America do? You all know the answer. And I've thought for many years that perhaps the Palestinians were the chosen people because they were blessed with Israel as an enemy. I'm not being flippant. because we have acted with more compassion and kindness to those bent, I should say, to the population, to the civilian populations of those bent on our destruction, with more kindness and compassion than any other power in history, period. Again, doesn't mean that Israel's perfect, but it means that when judged next to other nations that have faced similar challenges, we have a lot to be proud of. And we should be very proud of what Israel is doing in the world. How our technology, are those computers, those cell phones, that Waze program that got you here tonight, how it's transforming how we live our lives. We should be proud of our technology that is feeding great parts of the world and quenching the world's thirst for water. We should be proud of our medicine that is coming up with advances that are pushing the envelope in finding cures for Parkinson's and for multiple sclerosis. We should be proud of our science, which is also pushing the boundaries in chemistry and physics. And ladies and gentlemen, we should be very proud of our compassion. You look at what's happening in Syria on our northern border, and we're doing everything to avoid being sucked into that fight. But we do have a moral responsibility to treat those who are wounded, bleeding, near death, and we've treated thousands at this point. And we send them back. We don't show their face because we know they're going to be killed. And thousands have returned to Syria. And who knows, maybe they will be bridges for peace in the future. Many of them come with the same story. They say, we were told to believe you're the devil, and you're the angels who saved us. And we should be proud when there are natural disasters in Haiti and Nepal that Israel is the first one to set up that medical facility. But beyond that, there is something else, and the rabbi, I think, spoke about this. Beyond my optimism for Israel's power and my pride in Israel's values, for me, the most overwhelming feeling I have towards Israel is a deep and abiding gratitude. I recognize, and I'm sure many and hopefully all of you here do, that we have been given a priceless gift. We have been blessed with this gift of sovereignty that has been bequeathed to us by our parents and our grandparents. And sovereignty has given the Jewish people many things, but above all, it's given us three. The first is it gave the Jewish people a voice. Some of you may remember what the world was like before there was a state of Israel. Maybe your grandparents told you stories about a pogrom in a shtetl, about pleading with a local magistrate or the local policeman to come to the defense of the community, and they stood by and watched. Maybe they told you about what was happening during the Holocaust, when Jews, 10,000 were being killed every day in Auschwitz. May 1944, 10,000. Every single day in Auschwitz, and how they were pleading with Polish diplomats to go to Washington and speak to somebody who can speak to somebody and tell the world about what's happening. We had no voice. We had no ability to speak up on behalf of the Jewish people. And today, the Jewish people have a voice. The Prime Minister of Israel exercises that voice when he stands at the podium at the United Nations. He exercised that voice 2 years ago when he fulfilled a fundamental moral obligation that he has as the leader of the Jewish state in standing before the United States Congress. And I have the great privilege as ambassador of exercising that privilege, that right that we have to have a voice. Every time I go into the CNN studio or the BBC studio, that's the thing I think about. More than anything else. And it's not the next question that's going to be coming my way. It's what a privilege it is for us to be able to speak, to defend our people and to defend our state. A voice. That's what Israel gave the Jewish people. The second thing it gave the Jewish people is a refuge. I spoke a little bit about the rising tide of anti-Semitism. And it's a problem. It's a problem here in the United States. And it's a problem around the world, particularly in Europe. And people are asking themselves many, many questions about anti-Semitism, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it later. But one question no one is asking is, where are those Jews going to go? That was the question the Jewish communities asked for centuries. Read a book written 100 years ago. That was the question. Read a book written 200 years ago. Written 500, 1,000, 1,500 years ago. The question facing the Jewish community is, where will we go when this inevitable turn against the Jews happens? That's what people were obsessed with. And the Jews were expelled and thrown out from so many countries that people have forgotten. A few years ago, actually last year, the Prime Minister of France came out after a terror attack against French Jews. And he said very powerfully that without Jews, France would not be France. And he said, you know, we're not like Spain. Jews weren't expelled from France. Now, it used to be in antiquity, to be a great scholar, you'd have to sit for years and go over scrolls in Alexandria and the libraries there. Today, all you got to do is Google it. And I suppose one of the French Prime Minister's staff members didn't bother to tell him that French Jews were expelled from his country not once, not twice, but 3 times. And we were expelled from England, and we were expelled from Spain, and we were expelled from Portugal, and we were expelled from different places within the German Empire many, many times in the history. This was the thing that Jews were thinking about century after century. And the birth of Israel provided a refuge for the Jewish people. And they came from the killing fields of Europe, and they came as they were kicked out of Middle East and North Africa, Jewish communities that were there, some cases 2,500 years. That community that stayed, they were kicked out. And they came when the Iron Curtain fell, 1 million. And they were airlifted from Ethiopia. You know, Israel, that is routinely accused as being an apartheid state, is the only country that I'm aware of in history that took blacks out of Africa to freedom. And now they come from France, and they come from Ukraine, and anywhere else where Jews need a refuge. That was the second great gift, a voice and a refuge. And the third and most important gift of all, and this is the great transformation in the history of the Jewish people, is that we have been given the sovereign power to defend ourselves. For centuries, the Jews literally begged others to defend them. They pleaded with that local policeman. They pleaded and begged kings and presidents to do something to protect them. They pleaded 75 years ago for the leaders of the free world, great men. They pleaded with them to bomb the tracks that were leading to mass death. Well, today, the Jewish people beg no more. Today, the Jewish people defend themselves. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, the glass is not 1/16 empty. It is very, very full. And what you said, Rabbi, is 100% right. We tend to focus all the time on the problems we face. But everyone should understand that our grandparents and their grandparents, going back 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems with ours. 100 generations of Jews dreamed of the privilege that 3 generations have had, to live at a time when there is a sovereign Jewish state. That is the privilege that all of us have. And with that privilege comes a great responsibility. And that is to secure that dream for future generations. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, not a responsibility that falls on the shoulders of prime ministers or even of lowly ambassadors. It falls on each and every one of you. And in being here at a Jewish Community Center, in supporting your local Jewish community, you are actually fulfilling that responsibility. You become partners with us, with the state of Israel, the one and only Jewish state, in securing the Jewish future. Thank you.
Ambassador Dermer, thank you for that. We have some questions that were collected.
Now the lights go on. I couldn't see people before.
We do have some questions that have been submitted, and if people do have some questions, just raise their hand as well. First one that was submitted: what can be done to coalesce and unify the tension between non-Orthodox and Orthodox, both within Israel, religious pluralism in Israel, and also with the diaspora? And we saw this with the Kotel and conversion issues that came out. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Look, my views about Israel diaspora relations as a son of the diaspora. I'm the second. My immediate predecessor, Michael Oren, was the first American-born ambassador of Israel to the United States. I'm the second. So we grew up in Jewish communities here. I grew up in Miami. And to me, in my eyes, there is no more important law for the state of Israel than the law of return. That is the defining law of the state of Israel. Without that law, Israel is a different country. And it is the very DNA of the country, the very raison d'etre of the country. And you should know that that law is not defined by rabbis. It was defined by Hitler. The law of return was defined by him. Anyone whose life was on the line, if you were the grandchild of a Jew, you could be put to death. If you're the grandchild of a Jew, you can show up tomorrow in the state of Israel and you can become a citizen. That's this point about Israel being a refuge of the Jewish people. And nothing is going to change that. Nothing is going to change that. We also, I should say, have an issue that goes back 70 years about not citizenship in Israel, but life cycle events in Israel: marriage, conversion, divorce, which in Israel is run by the rabbinic authorities in Israel. That's how it's been for 70 years. It's not a new problem. It comes up from time to time, and this question that is sometimes called, who is a Jew? And that comes up, it usually boils to the surface every 20 years or so. And it hasn't been resolved, unfortunately. It hasn't been resolved. It's not an issue of citizenship, it's an issue of status. We have many Israelis who actually fly to Cyprus to get married because there is no civil marriage in Israel. Now, you could be for it or against it. That's just the reality in Israel, that civil marriage has never passed. And those born and those living here in the United States, it makes perfect sense to have civil marriage. But in Israel, that is not how marriage, conversion, and divorce is run. And what happened recently with the Kotel is that it brought this issue to the surface. And why it brought the issue to the surface, for those of you who are not in the weeds on this issue, there was a Supreme Court decision a few years ago. And the Supreme Court decision was that Israel had to build a proper egalitarian prayer space. How many people here have been to the Kotel? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. And those of you will know that a little bit south of the Kotel, by Robinson's Arch, there's an egalitarian prayer space, and it exists. Today, it exists. Last month, there were 49 bar mitzvahs on a single day. It was performed there. So it exists, and it will continue to exist, but the problem was it was not up to the standards of the other Kotel space. And so the Supreme Court, because there were a lot of different cases it was adjudicating, it said you have to make this, in Hebrew was makom ra'ui, an appropriate prayer space that would be open 24 hours, where there would be serious governance of that specific spot. The Prime Minister of Israel, who I have to say, I've been with the Prime Minister for 17 years. I do not know if there's been a Prime Minister in the history of the state who's had a greater appreciation for Israel and diaspora relations than this Prime Minister, probably because of the years that he spent here in the United States. He was the one who started Birthright as a Prime Minister. He walked into a government meeting in Israel one day and he said, you know, we're going to invest in bringing American Jews over to Israel. And people thought that he had taken something that morning because they couldn't believe that any Israeli Prime Minister was suggesting this. But that has created a fundamental transformation, particularly with a young generation of Jews, and connecting them to Israel in a way that even their parents were not, because of the masses, now about 500,000, who have come to Israel since then. So what happened was, when the court made the decision, he entrusted Natan Sharansky with trying to forge a compromise that would ensure that the Kotel would be a place that all Jews, that would unite the Jews, all Jews would call home. And what they did in this compromise is they actually went beyond what the court had asked for. Because the court was only said, build a prayer space that is makom ra'ui. But he went further. And the compromise dealt with issues that touches on this question of recognizing non-Orthodox streams. Two issues. One issue had to do with a direct appointment of a representative of Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism to run that place, directly appointed from the Prime Minister's office. And the second issue had to do with a joint entrance. What's important to remember and to understand is this compromise went beyond what the court asked for, and it passed Israel's government. But after it passed, members of our government decided, well, we don't think this is a very good idea, and so they sort of went backwards on it. And then the Prime Minister was trying to find a compromise to allow this whole plan to go forward. And recently the Supreme Court said to the Israeli government, you know, you've passed a decision about a year ago. Why haven't you implemented it? And a decision had to be made. And the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel's coalition came to the Prime Minister and he said, we want you to cancel the decision. And the Prime Minister refused. He said, I'm not canceling the decision. What I will do, because I have to answer the Supreme Court, and we are a country of the rule of law, is I will freeze a decision, but I'm going to build that space. I'm going to build that space, and the egalitarian prayer space in Israel is going to be equivalent to the other prayer spaces that you have. And all of you who go back to Israel in 8 or 9 months when that space is built will see that what I said here today is going to happen. And he said on these other issues that touch on recognition, we have to continue to have discussions. And that's where we are now. Now, that's not satisfying, I know, for people who would like to see a clear answer. But remember, the Prime Minister of Israel is not a king, and he's not a president. If 1 million American Jews move to Israel next year, I think there'll be a different compromise. They'll be worked out. But they're not. And there are forces who would resist the changes, and they sometimes are stronger than the forces that will bring about, that want to lead that change. Now, I'll tell you a personal opinion from my experience. A lot of people don't like compromise because they're messy and you never get exactly what you want. I believe these issues only can be advanced through compromise, only. Whenever you're trying to do something like this within Israel, the best approach is to try to find practical solutions and to keep working to address the things that you haven't settled, rather than to engage in ideological warfare, which usually tends to be counterproductive. And I'll give you two examples. You had a party a few years ago. Yair Lapid is an Israeli leader, and he ran on a platform of ensuring that ultra-Orthodox Jews would be in the army. And he went for a very sweeping proposal. And it was opposed by the ultra-Orthodox. By the way, they would have agreed, because of the position they were, political position they were in at the time, they would have agreed to 80% solution. But there was an attempt to push through a 100% solution of winners and losers. And the ultra-Orthodox parties lost. And a bill was passed. And everyone applauded. 4 years later, there's a new coalition. And that bill doesn't exist. And we've gone back, and in fact, even further back than we were the day it was passed. And then I'll give you a positive example of how you bring change to Israel. It has to do with an issue that you don't read about in the papers anymore, but some of you who have been following Israel for a long time may remember. We had a problem with actually burying Jews in Israel because of the religious laws governing burial in a Jewish cemetery. And so we had a situation where we had soldiers who risked their lives to defend the country and lost their lives defending the country. But they were not halachically Jewish according to Jewish law, and they couldn't be buried in Israel. It's outrageous. But we found a solution, quietly, a practical solution that solved that problem. And I strongly believe that to forge these types of changes, try to practically do whatever you can to move things in the right direction. Sometimes it takes a little longer than people think. And remember, we Jews were 40 years in the desert for a trip that should have taken all of about 4 days. So a lot of times it takes a little bit of time to get to where we want to go, but I'm confident that we will get there, and I hope all of you agree with me that we have enough wars against the Jews that we don't need wars among the Jews.
Thank you, Ambassador. Another question that was submitted is the following. Over the past few years, a good deal of attention has been paid to the question of Iran's quest for nuclear weapons. However, recently, world attention has been on North Korea. So how is Israel navigating the growing tension with North Korea? And does Israel have a policy or position regarding emerging nuclear powers besides Iran?
So let me get back to the issue of Iran. I don't want to re-litigate the whole Iran nuclear debate here tonight, and I think people of goodwill were on both sides of that debate. And one thing I will tell everybody is a general rule. Always have to tell the difference between an enemy and an adversary. This was something that I think was sometimes lost during the debate that happened. An enemy wants you dead. An adversary may disagree with how to achieve a common goal. But an enemy wants you dead. Hamas is an enemy of Israel. Iran is an enemy of Israel. Hezbollah is an enemy of Israel. Those people who supported the nuclear deal are not enemies of Israel. In our view, they were misguided about their policies, but I think it's important always to say that, because sometimes people can veer off, I think, in very problematic directions. But let me explain to you exactly what the problem with the nuclear deal was. Very simple. The nuclear deal does not block Iran's path to a bomb. What it did was it put restrictions on that program, handcuffs, if you will, for a certain number of years. And those handcuffs are automatically removed at a date certain in the future. And it's not that far away. Now those handcuffs start coming off in 3 years, 6 years, 8 years, 13 years. That's the latest. It used to be 15. Now it's down to 13. They're automatically removed. And those two words, automatically removed, is why Israel was so opposed to this deal. Because the world didn't say, well, we'll put those restrictions on until Iran stops being a nation that is sponsoring terrorism around the world, that is gobbling up countries in the region, that is committed to Israel's destruction openly and working actively in order to destroy it. It didn't say that. There's no linkage at all between those restrictions, removing those restrictions, and any act on the part of Iran. All that has to happen is the clock has to move and the calendar has to change. And then Iran doesn't sneak in or break into the nuclear club, it just walks in. It's just that that can was supposedly kicked down the road. This is if Iran keeps the deal. Understand, according to the nuclear deal, Iran doesn't need to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They just walk in. They just have to be a little patient. So that's why we were so opposed to it, because it's a path for Iran to get a bomb. But the price of making this deal was also to remove all the restrictions that were on Iran at the time, all the sanctions that were on Iran, all the countervailing pressures, which were paying, Iran was paying a huge price in terms of the blow to their economy. They were losing about 7% growth every year. And these sanctions have now been removed, and now Iran can sell oil to its heart's content, and now you have investment pouring into Iran. And they're going to have hundreds and hundreds of billions over the next decade that they would not have had if sanctions were on. And what did they do with that money? Well, I can assure you that they're not funding a GI Bill for returning members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. What they're doing is continuing their march of conquest. They now control Iraq. They control Lebanon. They are now in Syria trying to build a land bridge between the two so that they can go right from Tehran to the Mediterranean, and they hope to build a port on the Mediterranean. They want airports and seaports and land bases in Syria. And Israel cannot and will not allow for another terror front to be established against us from Syria. So Iran went from being a terrible problem to an even bigger problem, because it's a richer and more powerful country right now that has a clear path to the bomb and that right now is empowered to continue their campaign of war and aggression. Now, you mentioned, though, North Korea. The important thing to understand about North Korea, there's a couple things I want to say about that. First of all, when the deal was signed with North Korea, the world applauded. It was in the mid-90s. And 10 years later, North Korea had a nuclear device. And now they have ICBMs, and they can put a miniature device, according to these press reports, on that ICBM, and that has created huge dangers for your allies in Asia and even to the continental United States. But the difference between the nuclear deal with North Korea and the nuclear deal in Iran, there were many differences, but the biggest in my mind was the moral difference. Because at those nuclear negotiations, Japan and South Korea were at the negotiating table. And they were practically begging the United States to do that deal. So it's hard to blame either President Clinton or President Bush when your allies in the region are telling you to do this deal, and those allies are the ones that have the most skin in the game, and they're telling you to do the deal. In the case of the nuclear deal with Iran, Israel and the Arab states, the ones most to gain or lose if this deal goes south, were both of the opinion, we stated so publicly, they stated it privately, that the deal was a disaster. We weren't at that table, and the deal went ahead anyway. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind, there was something that happened in the press, some of you may have noticed about a week ago. It said that American intelligence agencies had discovered that North Korea can now miniaturize a nuclear device. Well, as of a few months ago, the intelligence didn't say that. They said they were far off. This whole deal, if you accept the fact that you have a certain period of time where Iran will be checked from its nuclear ambitions, is premised on intelligence. It's premised on knowing if Iran is weaponizing or not, knowing if they have a secret facility or not. Well, the intelligence was wrong on Iraq. It was wrong on Lebanon, on Libya. It was wrong on Iran. They didn't know for years about secret nuclear facilities at Qom or at Natanz. And now it's proven to be wrong on North Korea. So don't bet the future in the world on intelligence. We have one of the best intelligence services in the world. Israel. But we're not perfect. And your intelligence services are not perfect. I would bet on your own intelligence. An intelligence that says when a regime is calling and working for your annihilation, when they're chanting death to America and death to Israel, don't put them on a path to nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we have time for 2 more questions. The next question is as follows. The ongoing unresolved issues around peace with the Palestinians continues to be of grave concern to many American Jews. Given the challenges that the U.S. administration faces at home, how do you see the current attempt to once again revive the peace process, and what productive role can the United States and other allies play? What steps, if any, by any side, do you see in the short term, 12 to 18 months, need to happen to advance the peace process?
Okay, well, look, I will never blame an American president or an American Secretary of State or an American peace envoy for the failure of Israelis and Palestinians to achieve peace. I think those who do don't understand the root cause of the conflict. And this has, by the way, been the problem in dealing with the peace process from the beginning, because people don't understand why there's not peace. They think it's because maybe Israel is in territories captured in 1967. If only Israel would go back to those 1967 lines. Many people think it's because of the settlements. That's the reason why we don't have peace. Well, we had a conflict for 50 years before 1967. A lot of the world says to Israel, go back to the June 4th, 1967 lines and you'll have peace. But those weren't lines of peace. Those were lines of war. So what was that conflict all about? This conflict has persisted for a century. And the root of the conflict remains exactly what it was a century ago. That is the persistent refusal to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state, the nation state for the Jewish people, in any boundary. That's what the root cause of the conflict is. And to deal with it, that's not to say you can't have issues that exacerbate it. That's not to say that all of these issues that you read about in the press are not relevant. They're relevant in public opinion, they're relevant in politics, they're relevant in daily lives. It's all true. But it's not the root cause. The root cause is the refusal to recognize a Jewish state. That's what it's about. The legitimacy of a Jewish state. Not just the might of the Jewish state, but the right of the Jewish state to exist. And you have not had people internationally, and I don't blame any particular president. There have been many. But none of them have actually dealt with the root cause of this. When a Palestinian leader can walk into the United Nations and say that the Jewish people have no connection to the land of Israel, that the Jews have no history in Jerusalem, and when he can get a standing applause, there is no chance or prospect for peace. None. When he's not called out for saying these ridiculous things, when they wage campaigns to deny our history in the land, and you have to ask yourselves, why do they deny it? Arafat said to President Clinton at Camp David, he said, there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. And somebody at the time in Jerusalem said to me, I don't know if Arafat believes that or doesn't believe it, and I don't know which one is worse. The truth is, it doesn't matter. Because what the Palestinians are doing is they're poisoning the next generation to believe this. Not only are they not dealing with the root cause, but the Palestinians are poisoning the next generation so that the next leadership can't deal with the root cause. And if we don't address that, you're not going to have peace in 10 years, 20 years, or 100 years. Now, Oslo is 25 years ago. That's a whole generation. If people focused on these issues 25 years ago, You may be in a different place today, and I hope that we will begin to focus not on what's going to happen in 12 months or 18 months or a 4-year term or an 8-year term, but actually trying to move this region in the right direction by actually focusing on this problem. And one bright light here, actually, was that the U.S. Congress is starting to look into the issue of the Palestinian government paying people to murder Jews. It's an unbelievable thing. A lot of people don't know this. There's a law on the Palestinian books that says that if you murder Jews and you sit in prison, you get money from the Palestinian Authority. And you get more money the longer you serve in prison and the more Jews you kill. You get more money. Now, there's an act right now that is working its way through the Senate called the Taylor Force Act, named after an American serviceman who was murdered. And the person who murdered him is getting a salary from the Palestinian Authority. Now, this is not a small issue. It gets to the core of the conflict, whether or not they are prepared to begin to turn a corner and to seriously address these issues. We're going to have to deal with all the other issues, the settlements, the borders, all of that. But this is the issue. And when I'm gratified that you've seen now a bipartisan process move forward. People are starting to deal with it. It's affected, by the way, other governments in Europe that are starting to review their funding for the Palestinian Authority. And I just think if we get to a point where the leader of the Palestinians knows he can't say what he's saying at the UN anymore, he's not going to be able to sort of walk into the White House after paying $300 million to people who murdered Jews. And that the keys to international legitimacy is a real fundamental transformation of the Palestinian body politic. Not just Hamas, but among the Palestinian Authority itself. If that happens, then you will see the beginning of the crossing of the Rubicon. And I guarantee you this has been the case always. Whenever Israel faced an Arab leader who spoke peace and was prepared to make peace, Israel made peace. That was true when Menachem Begin, who everyone dismissed and said he would never make peace, when he faced a Sadat who came to Jerusalem and spoke peace, Israel made peace. And it was true of Yitzhak Rabin when he faced King Hussein. When we have a Palestinian leader who truly wants a historic compromise and to live in peace with Israel, then any president, any secretary of state, any envoy will be able to figure out how to close the deal. It doesn't require brilliance, it requires a moral clarity, and hopefully we're beginning to see a change there. One more question?
You know, I think we're going to stop right now with questions. We have a special presentation, so I'd like you all to thank the ambassador once again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. To conclude this evening, I'd like to invite to the stage Governor Eric Greitens to present something on behalf of the state of Missouri. Governor Greitens.
Thank you so much.
Well, good evening. First of all, I just want to say, Andrew, thank you so much for hosting us so generously tonight. And Mr. Ambassador, we are honored to have you here in the state of Missouri. It is an honor for us to have you here. And I think what you've seen tonight is that we have not only a strong and vibrant Jewish community here in Missouri, but here in Missouri and throughout Missouri, you will find a state where people across the state support and love the state of Israel. Now, I would just, I'll ask you for one moment of personal indulgence. This is a particular pleasure for me. As some of you know, I went to preschool here. And my mom actually taught preschool here for years. When I was in high school, I was a camp counselor here. And so it's a real joy to have you here, Mr. Ambassador. And I want all of you to know that, tomorrow, the ambassador and I are actually going to be taking a tour of the Early Childhood Center here. Now, many of you ask, well, why would we be doing this? Now, and the answer for many of you will be obvious. Well, I mean, Eric's trying to please his Jewish mom, right? But it's actually deeper than that. Is that we do have such a.
That's not a bad thing.
It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing.
That's how the world goes around.
Yes, but we also, what we want to show you, Mr. Ambassador, and what we're so proud of is the way this community passes Jewish values on from generation to generation. And we've done an extraordinary job of that. And I think that, the events of the past week have demonstrated to all of us why that is so important. That when we see in the face of white supremacists, in the face of racists, in the face of neo-Nazis, in the face of anti-Semitism, we have to have people who are willing to stand up. And what I'm so proud of here in Missouri is the way people have done that. I just want to brag for a little bit, Mr. Ambassador, on this community. When we had that terrible act of desecration at the cemetery, we heard about it on a Monday night. Tuesday morning, we put out a message on Facebook that we were going to go to the cemetery and that we're going to be there with rakes and cleaning supplies and that we're going to beautify the cemetery. And that day, I spoke to Andrew. And Andrew spoke to leaders throughout the Jewish community, and people came together. And it wasn't just the Jewish community, we also reached out, and I called the Archbishop, and I called the Missouri Baptist Convention, and I called local imams. And you know what they all said? They all said, we're going to come together to stand with the Jewish community. And by the time we showed up in the cemetery the next day, there were thousands of Missourians who'd come together to demonstrate that in the face of a terrible act of vandalism and desecration, that we could bring people together in a beautiful act of love and of service. That's this community, Mr. Ambassador. And I am particularly hopeful about the future of relations between Missouri and Israel. For so long, we have had wonderful relationships between companies here in the state of Missouri and companies in Israel, around cyber, around agriculture. Our universities are doing research together. Even Missouri's National Guard, we've engaged in an alliance with people, with the state of Israel. And we look forward to an ever more prosperous and ever stronger relationship. And so on behalf of this community, Mr. Ambassador, I wanted to present you with this proclamation. And in true Missouri style, we wanted to make sure, I know that you know this, but we wanted to remind you that it was President Harry S. Truman, a native Missourian, who was the first head of state to extend diplomatic recognition to Israel. And I won't read all of this, Mr. Ambassador, but at the end it does say that therefore I, Eric R. Greitens, Governor of the State of Missouri, do hereby honor and declare His Excellency, Ron Dermer, the Ambassador of Israel to the United States, a friend of Missouri, and hereby offer Missouri's continued friendship and support to the people of Israel. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.